Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We on the sex trafficking in Indian country advocacy curriculum. We are on Unit 2. We will begin in just about one more minute to let a few more people begin to join us. All right, again, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for Unit 2, Identifying and Screening for Sex Trafficking webinar. This is the third webinar in our 6-part webinar series from the Sex Trafficking in Indian Country Advocacy curriculum. This is a publication brought to you by the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition and the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. Before we begin today's webinar, I'm going to go over a few housekeeping tips. Your control panel will appear at the bottom of your screen as shown on the slide. All attendees will be muted during the presentation. Please use the chat box to submit a comment to all presenters or presenters and everyone. If you have a question, please use the Q&A box. We will try to read questions throughout the presentation, but we'll also have some time saved at the end for questions. At the conclusion of today's session, we ask that you please complete our webinar evaluation. A link to the survey will be in the chat box at the end of the webinar. The same link will also pop up in your web browser when the webinar session ends. And finally, it will also be included in the follow-up email that you received from Zoom following the webinar. We will be sending out certificates of attendance at the end of the full webinar series. You must attend all of the webinars for the entire length of the webinar to receive a certificate of attendance. And finally, this session is being recorded and the recordings will be posted in the future. Stay tuned. We are waiting on approval and working on the when and where they will be posted. All 3 parts of the Sex Trafficking in Indian Country Advocacy curriculum are available for download at www.tribaltrafficking.org. We will also post a link to the curriculum in the chat box. We encourage you to download the participant workbook and follow along. And I will now turn it over to Kelly to get us started today.
Thanks so much, Abby, and hello to all of you virtual folks out there in virtual land. We have a big audience today, so we're super excited to bring this Unit 2 to you all. And again, I'm Kelly Stoner with TLPI. In a few moments, my colleague Bonnie Claremont with TLPI will come on, and then also Heather Torres will come on in a little while, as will Abby will be coming in and out as we move through the presentation. So we had such great interaction in the chat box, both for the overview of the sex trafficking curriculum webinar, as well as Unit 1 webinar. And so we do here at TLPI take your input, your questions very seriously. We've looked through those and we have pulled out a few of those that we really wanted to say a couple words about today. before we get started. So again, these are comments that were put in the chat box with respect to Unit 1. So the very first one I want to address is anything of value. And then my colleague Bonnie will come on and address community awareness and education. So what the question that was in the chat box was something like this. Okay, it had to do with the exercise we did on anything of value. And the participant said, I hadn't considered the non-tangible items such as love, acceptance, attention, and other things as something considered of value, something of value. Although the participant says they do understand why, and then ask the question, if the prosecutor, do prosecutors actually use that sort of intangible benefit that's called that they're calling something of value? And so I wanted to take 1 minute or less to move to the next slide, and then we can come back to this slide for community awareness, and my colleague Bonnie will come on and talk about that. So if we could get the next slide. I have broken down, once again, the legal definition, and I want to just take just a bit to kind of go over this with you again, hopefully to answer the question that the participant had, but please stay with me. Please put it in the chat box. If you need more explanation, we'll find another way. So the sex trafficking statute, what you see in number 1 and 2 there, whoever knowingly, it gives you a list of things, or benefits financially or by receiving anything of value, really lean toward the perpetrator, the middleman, whoever's involved that's seeking to use this force, fraud, coercion to result in a commercial sex act. So that's what the prosecutor is really going to be looking at with respect to receiving anything of value. And this, the very number 2 here that you see, really sort of focuses on perpetrators. Did they receive money? Did they receive anything of value? Okay, so a little bit different than the anything of value exercise, still using the same term, but keep going. So we have to do 1 or 2 as a prosecutor, prove that. And we also have to prove this, that whoever knowing that force, fraud, coercion will be used to cause a person to engage in a commercial sex act. Or I have to demonstrate as a prosecutor, the person has not attained the age of 18, and these acts were done knowing that that person under the age of 18 will be caused to engage in a commercial sex act. I want you to look down to the very bottom of the screen, because this is what a commercial sex act is, defined by the statute. Any sex act on account of or caused by the receipt of anything of value, and it doesn't matter if the victim receives something of value or the perpetrator. It says any person received anything of value. And so what the prosecutor is going to have to demonstrate is that a commercial sex act took place, and there'll be some questions of the victim about, did you receive this? Did you receive that? Why was that valuable to you? So the answer is yes. Prosecutors will need to ask those questions and be able to prove that a commercial sex act happened beyond a reasonable doubt. I also think, just briefly, that this anything of value exercise that we did with you all last couple of weeks ago is super important, because if you look up to number 1, as a prosecutor, I also have to prove, at least 1, unless I'm going into number 2. I have to show that there's been advertising, solicit, all of those sorts of things. And I think offering, tantalizing, tempting someone with anything of value will also fit there. So there's a couple of places that fits, and that's one of the reasons we felt it was super important to have you all start thinking about that. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to you, Bonnie, and let you go back to the community awareness.
Okay, thanks, Kelly. So one of the evaluations, someone said that They like the idea of raising awareness in the community and making it public knowledge that sex trafficking will not be tolerated in order to dissuade traffickers from coming into the community, and wanted to know what that looks like. You know, traffickers don't want people who are being really vigilant over would-be victims. They don't like people having that kind of awareness, because that gives, you know, the secrecy and sort of the not being aware that what they're doing is trafficking is really what they want, sort of free reign. So, you know, it's really important that community education and awareness happens so that people can become more vigilant. There's still a lot of communities that don't think there's a problem of sex trafficking. So what our curriculum really is to help communities identify the red flags and so forth. It also, you know, there's a part of it that, you know, just more community public exposure to the problem of sex trafficking, whether that's a billboard at the, you know, at the reservation border, or, you know, more training to law enforcement and that sort of thing. And then also laws, right? So anyone coming into the reservation is aware that this reservation has really strict laws about sex trafficking, is also really important. Of course, there's going to be jurisdictional issues, which I don't want to get into right now, but for those that tribes have jurisdiction over, it's important to really get that information out there that sex trafficking won't be tolerated. It's going to be taken seriously, and people are watching. That's really kind of the emphasis on dissuading would-be traffickers. Next slide.
Before we jump into today's agenda, did you want to make a quick note on the nature of the curriculum, Bonnie?
Oh, sure. There was also a comment about from the evaluations that someone thought it was really, really basic and they already knew all this information. And the intention when we developed this curriculum that we start with really foundational, basic information about sex trafficking, because there are a lot of audiences out there that haven't gotten a lot of information about sex trafficking, and we wanted to make sure that that's where we started. That's where we start from, is, you know, on a foundational level, so communities can get this basic information. So it's really geared for people who are going to be doing this training and education to have a tool that can help them do that, to meet the needs of audiences that may not have gotten a lot of information about sex trafficking. So it's really is foundational.
Great, thank you so much, Bonnie. And so Unit 1, we just completed last time. That was our introduction to sex trafficking, right? That's why it was essential to go over both the advocate's definition and legal definition of what sex trafficking is. Now for today's work, and we mentioned to folks that we are going a little bit longer today, so we're going for an hour and 45 minutes. So hang on and stay engaged with us. For today's agenda, we'll be going over how to identify when trafficking is occurring. Who are sex traffickers? What do traffickers look like? What tactics are being used by traffickers? What are some correlations to domestic violence? Identifying red flags, and talking a little bit about assessment and screening as well. As we mentioned in previous webinars, we may not be able to get through all the exercises in this unit today. But we highly encourage you all to work on it with your teams, your families, your folks who are going on this educational experience with us through this webinar series. Next slide. So today's learning objectives, as a result of participating in this workshop today, we're hoping that you will be better able to identify quote unquote types of trafficking, identify methods used by traffickers against victims, identify red flags that may indicate a person as a victim of sex trafficking, and finally, identify actions that an advocate can take to make the victim feel safer during an interview. We are going to start off by engaging the chat, so make sure to get ready to view a video and respond. We're just looking for your initial reactions to the video, maybe what tactics do you see being used. So please get your chat fingers ready. And next slide, please, and I'm going to turn it over to Bonnie to introduce the video.
So this video is called Native American Trafficking, and you'll see where you can access it if you want to use it in your community. It's on YouTube. So like Heather said, just we want to get your initial reaction. Is it a video that you would use? What do you like about it? And then really looking for red flags, some of the words that are used in the video, you know, that'll give you an idea that this is trafficking. Maybe some tactics used by the traffickers. Locations, where is this happening? Where does that happen in your community? So it's a really good video to get that kind of discussion going with your audiences.
I remember when I was a little girl and I would hear some of the, women talking. They would say, "Whatever happened to Margaret? We haven't seen her for a while." The other woman would say, "Well, we heard she was taken on the boats. We haven't heard from her."
What we found with the Native girls from the reservations is there's quite a bit of recruitment, enticement, and I look at it basically as kidnapping from pimps. A girl who at the time was 16 was literally sold to the crew of the boat, and she'd been held captive on board this vessel as it made its way up and down the Great Lakes. They're identifying the disenfranchised segment of a population, and in this area, they choose to focus on the reservations.
Not that Native prostitution or trafficking is a small picture, because it's not. It's a lot bigger than people realize.
There are people who specifically seek out young Native girls. Where I work, it's an impoverished neighborhood. But at nighttime, you look around the streets and suddenly there are some really nice cars. Because there are people driving out half an hour to go buy young Native girls. I've never heard stories in all of my work as a sexual assault advocate like I've heard from the Native community. People don't see Native American women and girls as being human. They see them as punching bags, or as something that's really novel, like a new toy. That it's fun at first, but afterwards you throw it away.
I was raised in the 50s, and we would watch the cowboy and Indian shows. And I was always rooting for the cowboys, staying away from them savages. I did not know until I went to school that I was Native American, or that I was back then American Indian. I didn't know that until I went to first grade. So all of a sudden, I was one of them. What happened to the Native American people over the last 100 years has caused a lot of the problems that our young people are having now. The low self-esteem, the poverty, incest, chemical dependency. There's a lot of things that they don't have hope. They've lost hope.
Native Americans, in terms of life on reservations, they have the worst mortality rates anywhere in the Western Hemisphere outside of Haiti. And when you consider that they've been raised in poverty, there's a lot of addiction within the families. And then you take these young girls and you put them on the streets where the risk of being murdered is 25 to 100 times higher for prostituted women. And
Searching for love and affection and attention. And there's guys out there that will give it to you and that will make you feel special and cared about. But I also, at the same time, I knew that if I just disappeared, they really wouldn't care. And they'd never go to the police and say, our friend is missing. Because people just come and go on the street. You can see them for a few days and pretty soon they're gone.
Generally, the girls that are brought into this are targeted because they're vulnerable. They've already got an unhealthy situation at home, if they even have a home, or they're involved in drugs. And there's just something about that that comes across. And as soon as they're identified, the game is on. And that pimp can convince them to do anything, just to get a little bit of love.
We need to go after the pedophiles, and we need to go after the pimps. People need to recognize that the pimps are cruel. They truly are cruel, and they use any methods available to them to keep the girls in fear and keep them in prostitution.
it's important to talk about how it's considered a crime to prostitute. However, the punishment for solicitation is so minor, it's laughable.
The trafficking, the sex slavery, it's not seen as a social problem, it's seen as a victimless crime. So we need a shift in the thinking of what sex slavery actually is, and that these women and these American citizens are victims.
Okay, next slide. Okay, in your chat box, I want to just get your initial reaction. Did you like it? Would you use it in your audiences, in your communities? So people are saying, yes, I think that it is exceptionally important to recognize, especially in my area, how vulnerable children are. I really liked it and would use it. It's very impactful and heart-wrenching. I think hearing from the survivors themselves also definitely would use the video. It's a good video to raise awareness. I would use it. It touches directly on the trafficking on the Great Lakes and the boats. I think men have a huge role in preventing sex trafficking, what is happening with growing men into responsible citizens. Absolutely, you're right. Straightforward topic that individuals are uncomfortable with, but this video brings a face to the topic. Yes, some realistic insight for youth, teenagers, and community. Very informative. We would use this for training and community awareness. Brings anger at how much colonialism there is. Yes, there's an international port at where one of you are. It's good. It offers a lot of overall info in a short period of time. I like that about it too. I would like the tribe that I'm working with to be reflected in the video. Who is the funder? That I'm not quite sure of. Discussing the connection between porn, stereotype woman, dancing, etc. would be important. Yes, definitely. You know, if there's some images that don't quite fit with the message you're wanting to impart, you can certainly do that with some of the images that are in the video to add more clarity and to bring it into the context where you are. Yes, all of these things. What were some of the keywords, red flags that you picked up on? Targeting the disenfranchised, yes. Vulnerable, poverty, dehumanization, prostitution, poverty, yes. To address, important to address generational trauma, intergenerational, yes. Lost hope, no home, codependency, victimless crime, often used as punching bags, someone looking for love, absolutely. And these are also some of the tactics, which is one of the other discussion questions. You also have identified locations that sex trafficking may be occurring, like on boats. You know, and this one is, this video is in the urban area, of course, and you know, oftentimes there's that stereotype that it only happens in urban areas. So I think it would be important to point that out as well, that it's not always in urban areas. Yes, I agree with the disposability and the ideas that people have mentioned about Native people being less valuable. Absolutely. Pimp getting them to do anything. That prostitution, a laughable offense, a punitive practice. Yes, the punishment is really minor, is what the advocate was saying, that it's so minor that it's laughable. Yes, language is important. Trafficked versus sex work, pedophile versus John. I always said that. I don't like the term John. It's like, it's too nice of a word or name. Yes, somebody's tribe said they're located inland, so it's definitely important to note that it can happen anywhere. Absolutely, that's a key, I think a key component to mention, that it can happen anywhere. It just so happened that where this was made is near the boats and boat landing. We must focus on the demand. Absolutely, absolutely. Very good. We'll talk more about types of traffickers. And this one, it's kind of more focused on strangers, men on the boat, for example. Some of you have focused on what maybe you didn't agree with in the video, which I think is great, because these kind of videos give us a chance to then engage dialogue with the audience about things that they have concern about. And these would be some examples that it may not fit in your context where you live. So that would be important discussion to have. Yes, there was no reference to historical trauma or boarding schools. Absolutely, there could have been. And I'm glad that you picked that up and you can point that out in your discussions as well. Very good. Excellent comments. Yes. Overlooking this crime against Native girls as if they are nothing. I want to see how we can give them hope so they won't be vulnerable. Definitely, definitely. And a part of that is vigilance. Our traditions tell us to look after one another, to look after one another's children, because they're our future. Their well-being is really important to us. So that's one of the messages that in the education that I've done is really, traffickers don't like that vigilance. So it kind of goes hand in hand with really sending that message to our youth, our young people, that they're really important to us. Their safety is important to us. Okay, excellent. Thank you so much for your comments. They were great. Next slide.
Bonnie, just one comment came, I think, through the chat and Q&A that the video, I think noticing like a difference or a discussion point coming out of the video could also be that trafficking affects young boys as well as, like we talked about last time, our Two-Spirit and LGBTQ communities as well.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I was trying to read as it was rolling and missed it.
Yeah, a lot were coming in. Great job, everyone.
Yeah, that's great. That's exactly what we want. So yes, definitely, we cannot, exclude anyone. So it's really important to be able to, include that in your conversations of who's vulnerable and why. And we've been talking about some of that in Unit 1 and also here in Unit 2. So we want to talk about who are the sex traffickers, right? And so here's a list. I won't read them to you. Oftentimes there's sort of this belief in a lot of communities where I've visited that there's still that belief that it's mostly strangers. And I've even asked kids, I've talked to adolescents who seem to be really well informed, right? Some of them still think, it's the sort of the media image of a pimp. And that's kind of what they would describe when I say, well, who's a sex trafficker and what do they look like? So sometimes it's good to throw that kind of question out there just to get a feel for what people are thinking. But here's a list of people who could be a trafficker, people who could be traffickers. Basically, it can be any age, any gender. Often we think it's always just men, but absolutely, women can be traffickers, can be recruiting for a trafficker, all different personality types. So lots of different types of sex trafficking, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. Okay, next slide. So who do you think traffickers are? And you've kind of talked about some of that already. And again, when you think about these questions, think about them as you would use them in your community groups, in your audiences, right? So sometimes I feel like we're preaching to the choir because, again, like we said, this is really foundational and many of you have already know all this. You've been working with this, but again, it's a curriculum that's to be used for audiences, that may not have this information. So when you think about someone who was a trafficker or who could be a trafficker, what made you think the person was a trafficker? What are some of those red flags again? The greatest area of sex trafficking often in Washington state is often familial trafficking. Absolutely. This is often wrapped up with the pornography industry because they can resell pictures more than bodies. Especially when we have the technology now with, you know, people being able to get information out there to a large audience very quickly, right? Families also think that selling a picture is not trafficking. A grandma can traffic her grandchildren? Absolutely. How sad is that, right? So it seems like it's associated with drug houses and communities. Absolutely. Oftentimes we've seen that where drug trafficking is happening, it's really closely correlated with sex trafficking. That's also happening in the community. Technology and code words, absolutely. You know, I think there's even like a list of the different kind of code words there are, and it's important to maybe even be familiar with some of those words in that language. So, you know, we could be more vigilant, even especially with our children. If we're hearing them say these words in school, maybe there's someone in their school who's using those words as a trafficker who's trying to recruit for their pimp, their trafficker. Absolutely. Okay. Traffickers come from all walks of life is really the, you know, the overall message, and may be difficult to spot, may be difficult to identify because, you know, our Uncle Joe, you know, he just would not do that. Or our next door neighbors, we've known them for all of our lives. And, you know, and we may get suspicious, but we think, you know, that no, that they don't fit the profile of a trafficker. So we sort of like eliminate the possibility. So I think it's important for us, again, to keep in mind that traffickers come from all walks of life. And they could be our next door neighbors, a relative, and so forth. The line can blur between being trafficked and self-trafficked. Sometimes victims can become so convinced it is empowerment that they then harm themselves through self-promotion. Wow. Yeah. Yes, know the language of the young within sex trafficking, definitely. So, you know, when I was doing this work, this training, and a few years back, traveling around the country, working with tribes, and right in the midst of that, I heard one of my own tribal members was trafficking their child. And it just blew me away. You know, there I am thinking we're really progressive. We have our own tribal law enforcement, and we have our own domestic violence program, and we're just really with it. And then I heard about that in the midst of all that. So it was kind of an eye-opening experience for me. Okay, so it's really important to have the dialogue to sort of turn some of those myths around, the stereotypes that people may have about a trafficker or trafficking that's happening, so that we can sort of break down those barriers, right, in order to create better safety in our communities. Peer-to-peer trafficking is also a reality. Okay, someone asked, can you please distinguish the difference between sex work and sex trafficking? You know, I really believe that people who are victimized in the system of sex trafficking should not be criminalized. For me, that's sort of my bottom line. I get a little worried about the term sex work. There's still a lot of debate around it. There's a part of me, and I'll just put my own personal thing in here, maybe I shouldn't, but sex work for me, it's hard for me to put it in context when there's exploitation happening, that someone is consenting as that being their work, right? It's hard for me to put it in that context just for myself, being a survivor. But yet there's people that are also concerned about those that have been lured into the work, that are doing that work because that's the choice that they're making. They should not be criminalized for that, that it should be legal. So there's people that are in that, that take that position. I don't know if that helps, but Kelly or Heather, do you have any? I don't want to get too deep into that. Like I said, this curriculum being foundational, I'm hoping that there could be another curriculum where we could sort of delve deeper into some of those issues, because that's really a critical issue. And there's a lot of discussion around it. With tribes developing codes now, I think we also need to figure out a way that we can provide information to tribes that where they develop their own codes around those issues.
Right, Bonnie, I think you did a great job, that tension between exploitation and bodily autonomy, right? And what, and holding that in the balance as we're having these conversations. And I think it was really important what you emphasized, Bonnie, that, you know, the victims should not be criminalized as a baseline, whatever language is being used, but that the difference between sex work and thinking in those lines is really about bodily autonomy and choice, right?
Yeah.
But we always have to keep that exploitation kind of, it's happening in that larger context of exploitation, right?
Yeah.
So I think that was a great, thank you for that question. And I think that was you did a great job, Bonnie.
Thanks. And yes, thank you for your questions. It really means that, you know, you have a lot, you're thinking a lot about this, and it's so important that we do, because it is happening. It's a really huge problem in our communities that we need to grapple with and ask those difficult questions. Okay, next slide. Thank you for that. And thanks, Heather. So what do traffickers look for, right? You know, I think part of this for me as a survivor, and as an advocate who's worked with a lot of survivors of sexual assault and even sex trafficking, you know, it's kind of like, if we can just figure out why, right? Why did this happen to me? Why did that person choose me? That kind of thinking. So part of it, that's part of the reason why it's kind of like, if we can identify ways that our communities are vulnerable, what makes us vulnerable, what makes our people more vulnerable to being trafficked, then perhaps we can address some of that within, whether it's really educating would-be traffickers, and also maybe even addressing them in our laws, I think would be really important. So these are some of the examples, you know, and again, it's kind of like, it's really up to a trafficker what they're wanting, right? What they're looking for, what's going to yield them a profit, which is, and this really is the main, I think the main idea is really to gain power. And how they do that is, you know, having money, getting rich at someone else's expense, right? So people who can pass as many races or ethnicities. And as Native people, you know, there's, you know, they say that we often Native women can pass as other races, like maybe from Pacific Island, being a Pacific Islander, being from the tropics, you know, being Hawaiian, or so. If you could, you know, if you have a buyer that wants someone from that fits that, then that trafficker would have that person within their circle, right? Their circle of victims, their circle of women. So it will yield that trafficker a greater profit by having that available. You know, that person may not be Hawaiian, but they can pass as Hawaiian. People lacking a strong support system. Like I said earlier, you know, part of this is that traffickers don't want to bother or mess with anyone that's watching over them. They're, you know, they want to be, you know, sort of undercover and not be recognized. And that's what really, that part of that is control, where they, you know, they have a lot of control over the victim, you know, who the victim talks to, what they say, if they're ever questioned or asked about possible trafficking. So that's the last thing they want, is anyone, you know, being vigilant over this person. So that would be like adolescents that might be on the run, that ran away from home, that are couch hopping, for example. They're, you know, adolescents that aren't being adequately supervised. homeless youth, people from impoverished neighborhoods. You know, you have single parent moms, for example, that need to pay their rent, that need to put food on the table, that need to buy Pampers for their babies, to pay, you know, their cell phone bill. And of course, you put all this together, it's like, no wonder, you know, our Native communities, there's our people there are vulnerable to trafficking. People who are less assertive or mild-tempered, people who are vulnerable to blackmail, people that may have a history or may have warrants, or, you know, again, at the same time, this person has need for some financial help or stability, you know, of course, they're going to capitalize on that, the trafficker is. People have a strong interest in protecting others from the trafficker. People with alcohol or substance abuse issues, absolutely, you know, they need a way to support their addictions. People who previously been raped or molested or sexually abused. And of course, we know that the rate of sexual abuse in our communities with the historic trauma and a lot of our ancestors and relatives having been sexually abused, and how that has been pretty much intergenerational, makes, again, that's another factor of vulnerability that traffickers, you know, capitalize on, makes us vulnerable. I haven't been looking at the comments. Have you all, Kelly or Heather or?
Yes, there's a one interesting comment just came through about bullying and that kind of the personality of a bully, and if there's any resources or any correlations that folks have seen for folks who grow up being the bully, who would do the bullying growing up. Are those the type of personality traits that can translate over into becoming a trafficker?
Yes. Absolutely. You know, kids are socialized and, you know, are watching, learning from their parents, they're learning from older peers. And if bullying isn't, there's no intervention early on, either for a victim who's being bullied, you know, that young child learns that that person has gotten, that appears to be really powerful by the bullying that's happening. And they then learn that, well, if that's how that person, you know, obtain power, then I in turn can bully someone else. And it starts that kind of behavior early on, to, you know, to take advantage of someone, to harm someone, to put someone down, and I can gain power by that. And of course, it sets a tone for future exploitation of others.
Bonnie, I would just add one thing too. Not that necessarily every bully is coming from a domestic violence home or been exposed to domestic violence, but the same kinds of power control that we sometimes see in bullying, that translates, because we know that there is a strong intersection between the power and control dynamics in a domestic violence relationship that also occur in sex trafficking. So, I mean, red flags, yes.
Yes, definitely. Did I miss
Right.
any?
There was an important comment that, you know, just kind of what Kelly was getting at as well. Bullying as a manifestation of vulnerability sometimes, which could also make them just as likely to be a victim as well.
Yes. Very good. Single parents are a target. Absolutely. Absolutely. Like I said before, it's, you know, a lot of single parents struggle financially. And, you know, traffickers know that. Traffickers are not dumb. You know, they know that single parents struggle to make ends meet, and will use that again to entice a victim. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Kelly.
Thank you. If we could get the next slide up, this would be the point if you were teaching, instructing on this curriculum, that this exercise would pop up for you. And the exercise really wants to reinforce those concepts Bonnie just went over. And it's entitled, "What Do Traffickers Look For?" So based on the information Bonnie just had up on the screen previously, we wanted you to chat into your chat box what sorts of things you, as an advocate, someone who serves victims, provides services to victims, what sorts of factors are the traffickers in your area looking for? So if you could type in some of those things, it doesn't have to be the same answers that were on the slide, but this sort of gives the instructor of the curriculum some ideas of your communities, your service areas. So if we could get you to chat on which of those factors in your communities that are your service areas might make Native people more attractive to a trafficker. And these are starting to come in, Bonnie. Drinking or drug abuse problems they're seeing. Poverty. We've got 2 with poverty on there. And again, that sort of ties into all the exercises we've been going over. Lack of, let's see, these are going so quickly, it's hard to read. Seeking love, gay boys and young men. It's a rural area. That also can be a red flag, a factor. Age, availability to get housing, single parent households, unemployment, low self-esteem, not having a family or support system. Another low self-esteem, that's so huge. No father figure, casinos, gambling addictions, more about isolated rural communities. And really, Bonnie, aren't these the kinds of things that traffickers are really targeting? They're really trying to focus in on as they look for their next victim.
Yes, absolutely. You guys are great. You have hit on so many of what makes our tribal communities and our people that live in tribal communities so much more vulnerable. Because in a mainstream community, these are all what we'd be talking about recruitment factors next, is what the traffickers look for, right? It's kind of like, what are the easy targets to be able to recruit and entice people into trafficking for them. And you guys hit pretty much all of them. Not having support, a support system, low self-esteem, right? Not feeling.
Also, Bonnie, excuse me, interestingly, we've got some location specific comments here too. Man camps, proximity to man camps, traffickers that are looking for truck stops, those sorts of things.
Yes. History of abuse. There's such a strong correlation to the history and the historic trauma, the intergenerational trauma that still sort of impacts us, right, as Indian people, that creates that vulnerability. There's been so much work that's done in that. We've all done so much work to address that and to sort of peel away those layers, but they're still there for a lot of our people in our communities.
Should we move to the next slide, Bonnie?
Yes, please, next slide.
Great responses, everybody.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we've been looking at, risk factors already. Many of you have identified these in your chat boxes. And these are all factors that exist within our tribal communities. So it's no wonder when we look at the rate of sex trafficking that's happening, it's really high in our tribal communities. So, and we've already touched on many of these. There really hasn't been studies to be able to say, based on this study, that here are, the specific risk factor that will determine if someone will become a victim of sex trafficking. So in the meantime, before that happens, we just have to be able to put out there what we're seeing, what people are telling us as we travel around the country and what they're seeing. So age, absolutely, minors may be more susceptible, poverty, homelessness, substance abuse, and definitely our LGBTQ two-spirit relatives are very vulnerable, right? Because it's easy to be able to, you know, lure someone in who's afraid of things like being outed. And our relatives in the LGBTQ community and two-spirit community face those same challenges that we're talking about: poverty, homelessness, you know, have a history of abuse. So it's absolutely, you know, it all overlaps. Lack of a support system that we've talked about. I did a training one time with one of my friends who's done a lot of work in this area, who's a survivor of sex trafficking. Her name is Dr. Pierce, Sandy Pierce. And she kept talking about capable guardianship throughout this. We were talking about commercial sexual exploitation of children. So she kept talking about capable guardianship. And I thought, oh, that must be a legal term. I'll have to ask her about that. And someone finally in the audience says, excuse me, you know, can you tell me what you're talking about when you say capable guardianship? And she said, nosy aunties, nosy grandmas, nosy relatives, you know, and that's really part of, again, it's rooted in our traditions, in our cultural traditions, to really provide a support system to one another, not only as adults, but especially to our children, to really be on the lookout, to have that vigilance over in our communities, wherever we go. And when you do this work, it's like you start to see, you know, the red flags everywhere. I always equate it to being pregnant. And when I was pregnant, I started to see all, you know, all the pregnant women out there. So that's the kind of vigilance that we need to be able to sort of dissuade the traffickers from coming into our communities, like someone's mentioned earlier. If you're developmentally challenged, have some mental health issues, again, it sort of runs hand in hand maybe with the self-esteem. A trafficker that sees someone in that sort of like, you know, not being able to be assertive, standing up for themselves, sees them as being an easy target for trafficking. Lack of educational opportunities, you know, if there isn't those opportunities available, it's like then, you know, the employability again decreases. So, you know, the economic factors all sort of overlap with that. History of abuse and sexual abuse. You know, I always say, you know, as a survivor, I could easily see how sex trafficking, that I would be a target. It's like, well, I already know that history of exploitation. I know what that feels like. So why not make money, right, from it? So I can understand the thinking that goes behind that. Child welfare system and or being involved in the child welfare system or foster care system. You know, that kind of that feeling of no one cares about me. I'm just kind of out here doing whatever. And, you know, and of course, kids in that situation are having a lot of, you know, economic challenges as well. They see other peers that are wearing fashionable clothing, that have, you know, the expensive tennis shoes and designer handbags and so forth. And, you know, the manicured nails and the expensive makeup. Family history of violence and abuse. You know, if a person grows up with that, becomes kind of normalized. So absolutely, these are, if you put all of these together, it does create that a climate, a community where we could be really vulnerable to sex trafficking as well as our children. Okay. Next slide.
Okay, so this exercise, the previous exercise we just did really targeted what traffickers are looking for. You all were great with your responses. There may be some overlap into this exercise too. However, this exercise is focusing not really on what the trafficker is looking for, but the risk factors that Bonnie just went over with you. And so we hoped in this exercise to really get the participants, and that would be you all today, to start focusing on when you're interviewing, what are you looking out for? How are you? We're going to talk about screening later, but what might be a risk factor in your mind that says red flag, red flag? And so if we could get everyone out there that's willing in the chat box just to type one risk factor that you feel that you're seeing in your community or service area, and this is something that really causes you great concern that this might be a sex trafficking case. Okay, so Bonnie, trying to get you some responses here. They come in so quickly. Drug and alcohol, substance abuse. Let's see.
Foster care, history of drugs, alcohol within the family.
Yes.
Casinos.
Young girls wanting to impress their older boyfriend. That's a risk factor. One of the participants says that really, that begins to make her get really, she needs more info to assess. Casinos, 24-hour casinos, risk factors, someone who's hanging out there, or online predators is another one. An individual that's easy to abduct, truck stops again, interstates running through with truck stops that are maybe at the crossroads of a couple of states. Risk factor identified here, the code of silence between groups of people.
Yes.
Seeing homelessness. A few folks are seeing homelessness in their communities. Proximity to oil and gas extraction sites.
Yeah.
We see those location specific places that these participants are really, they're honing in on that, along with the parking lot of the casino. So yeah, thank you all for that. Great job.
Yes.
We ready to go to the next slide? They're still coming in. They're all very good.
Excellent comments. Thank you so much. So, you know, along with all the different risk factors, we have the types of sex trafficking that happens. And it may appear in many forms, right? And look a little different in each type. You know, and as technology changes and you know, it's sort of a fast moving world that we live in today with the technology that's available. You know, this also has an impact on the type of sex trafficking that can be happening and the kind of vehicles that are used, right, by traffickers. And being able to use technology with the internet, with websites, you know, and luckily some of them have been taken down, which I think is absolutely great. Like Craigslist, there was a link there that, you know, traffickers were utilizing. Backpage, I think, has been taken down. So, you know, I used to use some of the examples, you know, where I'd go, every community has, you know, usually a urban area close by. So I would click on that, and sure enough, in that urban area close to that reservation, there would be traffickers saying, here's, you know, a beautiful young Native woman. And all the while I would always think, how do I know that that's not an adolescent or a child, right? So I'm glad that those websites have been taken down. For the most part, they still exist. So the different types of trafficking.
Bonnie? Sorry. We had one comment coming in that there are dating apps that we also need to be very aware of, trying to come across as a dating app, but instead it's a trafficking app.
Yes, definitely. I just think, you know, putting this out there is a way to create that kind of identifying possible red flags, you know, and especially for families that have kids that are always on the internet, right? To be able to know where they're going, who they're chatting with, and so forth. So family trafficking, we put right at the top, because it's kind of like people may not be aware that it could be families that are trafficking family members, like a family that's trafficking their child. Like the example that I gave, that was, they were bringing in people that trafficked their child right in the home. So they were bringing in buyers right in their home for their 14-year-old daughter. Or, you know, spouses trafficking a spouse, a husband trafficking his wife, and you know, a boyfriend trafficking his girlfriend, for example. And it can be any gender, of course, in those situations. Organized criminal trafficking, and this could be, you know, corporations, businesses, store owners, and of course, we talked before about how it could be even or connected to drug trafficking, which we're starting to see a lot that's happening in our tribal communities. People who are coming onto the community to sell drugs, to deal drugs, looking for dealers, looking for people to sell their drugs. And of course, they're going to capitalize and also, you know, recruit and recruit possible victims and recruiters, other recruiters. So, and then gang trafficking could be associated with specific gangs that are in our tribal communities. Pimp trafficking, this is, you know, a single person, but that person may have more than one victim, for example, may have several victims at their disposal. Let's see, officials trafficking, this could be elected officials, elected tribal leaders, law enforcement, and anyone that is, you know, abusing their official power or their authority. I've, you know, spoken with victims who've been trafficked by people involved in the courts or on law enforcement, to say, we'll overlook this, you know, warrant if you do this, if you know, trade for sex, and we'll toss this warrant or this, you know, this violation.
Bonnie, there was a comment here as well about clergy and ceremonial leaders.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for that comment.
And just a time check, we've got about 30 minutes left, so we can leave a few minutes for questions.
Okay, Kelly?
So if we can move to the next slide, and we can do this one quickly, I think just sort of pointing out the structure of the exercises in the participant work group. This exercise really focuses on the types of sex trafficking that Bonnie just went over with you. So for those of you who will be instructing and training using this curriculum, it's followed by an exercise, an opportunity for participants to really dig into what's going on in their tribal communities or service areas. So some of you've already typed in the response to this, and thank you for that. If you could just type in a type of sex trafficking that you know or you strongly suspect is going on in your community. And if we can go back to the types, that slide, Abby, just before this one, to refresh everyone's memory. And if folks could just type in one type that they see. And we've already heard about official trafficking with in the religious realm. I'm also seeing, Bonnie, familial. Oh my goodness, like 3 or 4 of those, 5, 6 of those. Another, Ubers or taxi drivers.
Ah.
Another thing that's interesting, Bonnie, on the chat, we're getting some of those sites that you can visit. There's some examples there. So if folks want to, you know, kind of be aware of those, so you can use it as a screening tool. Officials, folks are seeing officials, youth, recruiting youth, businesses or conferences, but it looks to me like, just looking at this right now, the overwhelming majority is family members.
Wow, third-party exploitation, pimp, peer-to-peer. Yes. Wow. You know, when I first started doing this, this was like maybe 3 years ago or so. I can't remember how we had this TA grant, and it allowed me to travel across country to tribal communities. When I would ask the question about what's happening in your community, what types of trafficking are you seeing? Almost always it would be like, well, just people that are strangers that come onto our community is what I heard by far the most. So this is amazing that you all are seeing all of these different types of trafficking happening now.
I'll point out too, Bonnie, the familial type of trafficking, it's including children, it's including, you know, relatives, but also it includes spouses that might be trafficking their spouse or partner. So again, just a wide variety of different things.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. Okay. So I want to talk about tactics. So once a victim is identified, we have a trafficker who kind of spots this person who seems to be really vulnerable and might be open to, you know, the possibility to, you know, bring that person into within that person's control as a victim. Traffickers then have to, you know, use some actions to start the victimization process. So, you know, these are the various tactics that traffickers may utilize, and there could be more. These are just a few that we've listed. So fraud, offering that person, you know, exciting business opportunity, you know, to get rich quick kind of a proposition, right? False promises, things like, you know, I'll take care of you, you'll be safe, you'll make some money really quick, those kind of promises. I won't hurt you, you can trust me, we're in this together, we're partners. False promises or drugs and alcohol, like we said before, you know, if that person isn't already abusing or addicted to drugs or alcohol, oftentimes the trafficker will create that kind of addiction or abuse alcohol or drugs, or even help that trafficker sell alcohol and drugs, because then it becomes kind of a hook, right? Because that person now has to have some way to pay for that that drug or that alcohol. And especially if there's addiction issues, then definitely they need to pay for their addiction. Some of the tactics really symbolize or are similar to domestic violence tactics, where you see batterers that really maintain a lot of control over the victim, where the victim goes, who that victim speaks to, talks to, where, you know, having control over the finances and only allowing the victim to have a little bit of the money. Threats for blackmail if that victim is engaging in anything, even the fact that they're out there being prostituted or being bought by Johns, it's like that, you know, the trafficker will tell them that, well, you're engaged in, you know, illegal activity. If the tribe has, you know, prostitution on their books, they're going to potentially use that against the victim and say, well, you're going to get arrested. You know, the cops are going to arrest you for doing what you're doing. And if especially if that person has prior warrants, or if they have children, you know, they want to avoid that system completely. So again, the trafficker can use that to his or her advantage. Gifts, special treatment, luxury items, and again, it becomes that financial dependency, you know, or that, you know, that person doesn't have the financial means to, you know, secure expensive clothing, designer handbags, to get manicures, if, you know, they're expensive, or, you know, eat in fancy restaurants, stay in, you know, luxurious hotels and so forth. And these are all things that traffickers can use again in order to keep that victim in their control. May also, you know, threaten the victim that if they have children, to say, you know, I'll harm your children. I know where they are. I'll harm your family. And those kind of threats often are also used. Okay, next slide. I'm going to have to move along a little quickly. Sometimes the inflicting sexual, emotional, or mental abuse, again, like a domestic violence batterer, can, you know, we often hear that happening where the emotional, you know, control or the putting that victim down, really making them feel like they're responsible for the abuse. We see traffickers who rape their victims, inducing or enabling substance addiction, threatening to harm the victim's family, withholding money, violent physical assaults, where the victim really becomes fearful of the trafficker, you know, and that's again part of that control, because really the motive is for power and control. Torture, rape, imprisonment, you know, holding that victim against their will often. And oftentimes we're led to believe that it's always done by physical restraints, right? And yes, that can happen, but sometimes it's really that emotional control. You know, if I leave, he's going to find me, he's going to kill me. And especially if that victim knows they have the means to do that, that the trafficker has weapons, for example, or even if they don't, you know, there's such an intimidation that happens that, you know, they already have that control, even if they're not going to do physical restraints. Debt bondage, you know, I've done all this for you, you owe me, you're not, you know, you can't leave until you pay me back. Psychological abuse, brainwashing, you know, we're in this together, we're a team. You know, if you go out there, disclose to anyone, they're not going to believe you, especially if that trafficker has authority or has, you know, status in the community. It makes it a little more difficult for that victim. Being coercive, you either do this or I will, you know, whatever the punishment might be, go without food or not be able to see your family, your children. False affection, you know, I care about you, I'm here for you, you know, you can rely on me, and that kind of that false intimacy starts to happen. Keeping that victim isolated, just like batterers do often with battered women, keep her from seeing her relatives, her friends. Fear of arrest or prosecution. Okay, next slide. So like I've been saying, there's a high correlation between domestic violence, a lot of physical, psychological methods of power and control where, you know, even just a look, you know, that trafficker, just like the batterer, just takes a look, you know, oh, he's angry, I need to really adhere to what he's saying. Victim has an overwhelming sense of fear that batterer is going to, or the trafficker, just like the batterer, is going to harm them, has that kind of, there's so much control over that victim that they don't even really need to have, you know, the physical part of it, that they have, that batterer has such control. Beatings or physical restraint not necessary. Dependency, they've come to depend on this person, you know, they're sort of been alienated from their family, their friends, and this person is really all that they have to rely on, you know, a roof over their head, some financial income. That trafficker knows, you know, if he gives that victim just a certain amount of money, that that victim will stay, right? Dictates or restricts movement outside of their control, isolation, which I've already mentioned. So these are all very similar to domestic violence tactics. Next slide. So the threats and physical abuse may also enforce silence when the victim comes in contact with the justice system. You know, they're all of those reasons, you know, they're that dependency, that false intimacy, you know, they sort of have become emotionally connected to that trafficker. They don't want to turn that trafficker in, just like a battered woman doesn't want their, you know, their batterer to go to jail. Those same kind of elements can be there in this situation as well. Emotional harm can be just as damaging to a victim as physical violence. Absolutely. For example, threatening to out an LGBTQ individual to their community or family may mean the loss of social and economic support. Absolutely. There's a lot at stake for this victim, right? And the victim knows how to capitalize on that. Next slide. For those encountering victims of trafficking through the justice system, remember that dynamics of control and coercion may affect the ability to use legal system resources effectively. You know, they're fearful. They may not want to report. They want nothing to do with the legal system. And even prior to that, if they've had bad experiences with the criminal justice system, that may again totally reinforce their lack of trust, and they're not wanting to report or use the legal system in any way. And they have already some notions about what's going to happen to them, and also wanting to protect the trafficker. Okay, next slide. Some of these things I've already discussed, even like the sex trafficking, domestic violence can include isolation, economic abuse, and gaslighting, making that victim believe that it's her responsible, it's her fault for what's happening to her or him. Next slide. Oh, never mind. Okay. So if you've worked in the area of domestic violence, you've heard of the power and control wheel. And again, as I've been saying, there's a lot of correlation between sex trafficking and domestic violence. So this is a wheel that was developed very much similar to the domestic violence power and control wheel. So you'll see all of the tactics in the spokes of the wheel, the emotional abuse that I've been talking about, humiliating that person, calling them names, playing mind games, making the victim feel that they're responsible for what's happening to them, convincing the victim that they're the only one that cares about the victim, isolating that victim, denying or blaming, minimizing, making light of the exploitation, denies that anything illegal or exploitative is occurring. So really kind of making that victim believe that there's nothing wrong with what we're doing here. We're making money, and you know, you're in it just as well as I am. The sexual abuse uses sexual assault as punishment or means of control, forces the victim to have sex multiple times a day with strangers, right? And basically it's like slavery. We said in Unit 1 that it really is like modern day slavery. You do as I say, you go out and you know, your job is to make money for me and for us. Physical abuse, absolutely, you know, physical abuse can be a part of this. Also may induce drug addiction as a means of control. Using privilege, treats victim like a servant. You're at my disposal, you do as I say. You know, you get back here at a certain time, you have to meet a certain quota for the amount of money that I expect you to make, and you don't come back here until you make that amount of money. So the economic abuse, the victim rarely sees very much money. The trafficker may give that victim a little, just to keep, you know, to keep control of that victim, to keep them doing what they're doing. Coercion and threats. Again, I've talked about that, threatening to out them, threatening to report them to police. And it leaves the victim often feeling very shameful. And again, that's going to keep them from, you know, disclosing what's happening to anyone, especially to law enforcement. They're feeling responsible. They're feeling at fault for what's happening. Okay, next slide. So this is the domestic violence control wheel. So I'm not going to go into it, just to show that there is a strong correlation between the tactics used by batterers are very similar to the tactics used by sex traffickers. So we included this in the curriculum as well to show that. Next slide. So red flags, these would be the red flags that you may see when you're working with the victim. And your work, maybe your work, has you in contact with people in your community, and they're coming to you not necessarily as a victim of sex trafficking. So, these are some of those things to really be mindful of. Someone who appears to be really fearful or extremely intimidated, unwillingness to maybe make eye contact, looking malnourished. This trafficker wants this victim to have a certain physical appearance, for example, or may use food as a way of punishment, right? There might be signs of torture or abuse of some kind. There might be some bruises. It's not real likely because, like batters, they don't want that to be real visible, because that might, put someone on alert that this person is being abused or perhaps even trafficked. Tattoos, burns, brands to indicate ownership. If the trafficker has a name, a nickname, or a name that this victim uses as they refer to the trafficker, that might be in their tattoo. Signs of substance abuse and addiction, tracks on their arm, for example. And some of these may exist without this person being a victim of trafficking. These are just some things to be aware of, that if you see these, they could be possible trafficking happening. Clothing inappropriate for the climate. Again, that trafficker often is going to sort of determine or how they want this victim to look. Personal hygiene, unkempt. If they have been held for a period of time, maybe they haven't had a chance to take care of their personal hygiene. Next slide. Or even depression could be happening for this victim, and they've kind of gotten to that point of not caring enough to take care of themselves physically. You're talking to this person, maybe this person is in a situation of domestic violence, for example, and they receive a call on a cell phone, and they're so concerned about, needing to take that call and glancing at their phone all the time. Signs of external monitoring, lack of freedom. You see someone maybe standing over on the side, maybe a man standing over on the side listening in on your conversation. Really scripted responses, that person, you ask a question and they answer, and then you ask another one, they answer in the same way. They keep sort of repeating things because the trafficker may have said, well, if you ever question, this is what you say, right? Financial dependency, not having a lot of money to do what they want to do or need to do. They say they're not in danger. I'm fine. No, it's not. That's not what's happening at all. Nope, I'm fine. So a lot of denial about what's happening, but underneath that, they may be afraid, and they may be looking for you to identify it, so that if they find a way to come back to you for help, that might be available. Incomplete or contradictory victim disclosures, right? They're afraid that maybe they've said too much and they want to change what they've said, just to sort of lead you away from the possibility of what's really happening to them. I see there's comments coming in. Do either of you want to bring those up or address them?
Hi, Bonnie. Yeah, we're seeing some comments that talk about some red flags, obviously, like every time a woman comes in for a pregnancy test or an STD and she's accompanied by a male, when the perpetrator speaks for the victim, possibly trying to answer questions, things such as nail designs, someone who's running or is homeless, those sorts of issues. All great responses. Thank you.
Yes, very good. All very appropriate. A trafficker speaking for a victim. Absolutely. Absolutely. Receives a call or text that makes them want to leave immediately. I have to answer him. He's, that kind of fear trigger. Signs of external monitoring. Oh, I already said this. Okay, next slide. Cuts ties. These are adolescents. I don't want to go into them real deeply. It's those kind of red flags where you kind of think this just doesn't seem right, right? someone older may be picking up or dropping off a student at school when we have actually in class, in school classes. But things that just look out of the ordinary. I had that happen to me one time. I pulled in at night at a casino where I was going to do some training at another reservation. And I saw two young girls standing by a car, and this older gentleman came and he got in the front and they both got in the back. It's like, huh. So I took the plate number and I reported it to the hotel. And I was going to even talk to law enforcement, but I didn't. School attendance dropping refers to sexual situations that are beyond their developmental age. If you have maybe a middle school person, a young person who talks about sexual situations, accompanied by someone who monitors who they talk to, what they say, has clothing, jewelry, hair, makeup that they can't afford, and you begin to wonder where they got that, how they got the money for that. Complains that someone is taking all their money away. So if you see kind of a pattern, maybe one thing isn't necessarily going to say that sex trafficking is happening, but you start to see a pattern. It would be really important to start sort of visiting with this young person and really sort of inquiring more for more information. Next slide. Okay. Common red flags include control by the trafficker who may be monitoring the victims every move, especially true for youth victims who can be more vulnerable to the trafficker's tactics. Again, these are kids who may not be well supervised, right? They're sort of allowed to come and go and run the streets and run the community and on their own kind of thing. And have parents who are preoccupied with other things that they're doing. So that leaves them being really vulnerable. And I've heard a lot from people who work in the community with adolescents that they know where sex trafficking might be happening. And if they're asked about it, they may get really upset and get really annoyed. So they don't have that kind of demeanor of a typical victim, whatever that might be. They just seem to be really outspoken and really kind of angry even that you would ask that. So just be aware that, there isn't any one profile, but there's many different possible red flags. Okay, next slide.
Okay, Bonnie. Due to the time restraints, I wondered if we should maybe just pivot a little bit. I want you to be sure to have time to go into the interviewing piece of this. And I thought maybe we could discuss what the purpose, the objective is in this small group exercise, and how this exercise might be delivered if a person is using the curriculum to train other disciplines on sex trafficking. Do you want to go over that real quickly?
Sure. So in your in this curriculum, we have an exercise where you have 6 fact patterns, and they're different type of scenarios where sex trafficking could be happening or is happening. And then you also you break up into groups, and you have groups discuss those fact patterns by giving them some questions that they can answer in their small group exercise, whether or not sex trafficking is happening in these situations. If they're not quite sure what additional information might be needed to know for certain if it's happening. Is there a sex trafficking victim in this scenario? Who is that? What are the red flags? Why would someone not identify this as a possible sex trafficking scenario? What are the safety concerns for this potential victim? And I really like that piece, that question there. What are the safety concerns? Because in your interaction with a possible victim, even if you just suspect that this could be happening, always look at what are the safety issues that are there for this victim? How can you help maybe create some safety measures for this person? Maybe even saying, sex trafficking, I know that sex trafficking is happening in our community, And I just want you to know, if you or someone you know is being trafficked, I'm really concerned about, your safety or other people's safety in that. And maybe, maybe we could talk a little bit about the safety. So it's not like you're saying, I think you're being trafficked, but putting it out there in a way that, if it is happening, here's some safety precautions, right? So I think that's also really important in the work that we do with people, or especially where we think it might be happening. Okay.
Just to help keep pace, we have about 10 minutes left.
I'm too old school, and this time thing is like, So interviewing a victim, I don't like the term interview, for one. I also don't like the term victim, but I think we use them more for just sort of convenience. So I want you to just bear with that in this curriculum. It's just easier for us to use those terms. So I encourage you to use whatever term is right for you. I like the term visiting with someone that we're working with, right? So just be aware of that. And of course, our cultural traditions really guide us in this work that we do with victims, victim survivors, people that we're working with. So first, finding a private, comfortable space where there's no interruptions, shutting off the cell phones, closing the door. All of those things I think are really important. Right away, to share information about the victim's right to confidentiality. If you have even your confidentiality policies, it would be really good to show them that, so they're aware of that they're safeguarded by these policies. If they're going to share information with you, it's really up to them what they want to share with you. You also have to really inform them of your limitations. If they share with you that a child is being abused or neglected, that you can't keep that confidential, to be able to put that out there early on is important. Limiting the length of each meeting so that it's like, you can, it kind of opens the door for future contact if they want. So if there's something immediate, more emergent to talk about, that would be important. Utilizing small talk as appropriate. Oftentimes you don't want to just go right directly to sex trafficking, right? Because this victim is already feeling a little maybe apprehensive, a little anxious, and they're already feeling fearful. So, visiting with them about other things, where they live, how, is it safe there? Those kind of questions I think are important. Those kind of icebreakers, what school they go to, about friends, what they're involved in, being honest with the victim about what you can do, how you can help them, your own limitations, the work that you do, your job, and so forth. Exercising patience, as it may take time to gain a victim's trust. I've heard it said that oftentimes, you talk with someone on that first situation, you may not even talk about sex trafficking, but again, them knowing that you're concerned about their safety, again, sort of keeps that door open for them to contact you again, if indeed sex trafficking or they need some additional help. Acknowledge the harm caused and validate it may be difficult for a victim to disclose information. Just helping them understand that you have a sense of what they're dealing with, what they're encountering. Differentiate yourself from the trafficker. Oftentimes we start to put out there all sorts of rules and policies, and you have to do this and you have to do that kind of thing. That starts to take on the appearance of a trafficker, right? To having that kind of power and control and using that authority. And that's really, I think, for a lot of the people we work with, a little intimidating. They want to just sort of retract away. So it's important that we not use those same kind of tactics, for lack of a better word. Avoid personalizing victims' distrust of you or other service providers. They've been harmed by people that tell them they love them, they care about them. So they're going to maybe perhaps be a little defensive, If you ask questions that are a little too sensitive to them, they may come back in a little bit upset way or angry way. So it's important not to personalize that. It's really the totality of their experience and their exploitation, not to trust. Are there any comments, questions?
Yes, there was a comment about showing support spiritually as well,
Yes.
offering to pray with them if they'd like.
Absolutely. And I usually put that early on, and I apologize that I skipped that. It's really good to have even the availability of sage, cedar, sweetgrass, just so that, you know, if it works out that way, if that's something your tribal nation utilizes, or other similar kinds of medicines, and, you know, in a atmosphere that's safe to do that, of course, because when we talk about people who are exploited and abused, or you know, and more so in this situation, trafficked by, say, someone who has like a spiritual role, then it would be a little scary to put that out there in this situation. So again, every situation is going to be a little different, but having the availability of even sage and so forth is sometimes helpful. Respect that person's right to speak with you and to decide how much information they want to share. They may not even want to talk about anything related to exploitation, and that's fine. It's up to them whether they choose to report to law enforcement, and even as simple as where they want to talk to you. Is this place safe for them? Does this feel safe to them? And their choice to stop the interview at any time, because this can get really scary for them. And tell them that, to let them know, I know this is really difficult. Anytime you want to stop, we can stop. Some of them may want to return to the trafficker, just like when we work with battered women. Many of them go back and forth, right? They leave because, you know, they've been harmed. There's still that emotional attachment, so they may go back. There still may be that dependency on that trafficker or that batterer. That's what causes that ebb and flow between the trafficker and the victim, or a battered woman and a batterer. Okay, next slide. Safety is always number one, always. And I've said that before, you know, if nothing else, that you would get at really trying to identify safety, their need for safety. How are they, where do they live? Are they safe there? Are you safe talking to me right now? Is anyone watching, listening, and so forth? So safety is so critically important. Next slide. Even to the extent, I want to say that it can be a life and death situation. So again, you know, we don't want to miss the opportunity to address safety with anyone, whether we feel that sex trafficking is happening or not. It's really important to be able to broach that topic of safety is so important. Okay. Next slide. So this unit was also to focus on screening tools. And we know that there's not a lot of screening tools available in our tribal communities that are culturally appropriate. So when we do in-person training, we actually help the group, we break up into small groups and give them sort of a template where there's a series of questions, and we ask the small groups to look at what are some of the questions you would pull from this template to be able to make a screening tool of your own, right? And it really is to help us determine if sex trafficking is happening, right? And however you do that really is something that you all decide for yourselves. But, you know, in our training, at least in the training that I was doing, people were saying that we need that. We need screening tools. So where are we in terms of time? And
we are right at time, actually, but Bonnie just did an overview of Abby. If you can move up the slide. This is the small group exercise in your workbook. It should be around page 64, 65 that Bonnie just outlined for all of you, that you can do at home and at your workplace and with your communities who are going through this education and awareness work with you. And then I think we can move on to the next slide, and we might not be able to take live questions today as we wrap up, but you all have been great in the chat. So thank you so much, and we hope we've been responsive. I think, Kelly, we're on slide 39.
Yes.
And these are just the questions that
Yes.
are part of the discussion, right?
Yes, this goes back to that screening tool and really some exercises where you can turn this screening tool into something that is very useful in your particular tribal community. Yeah. If we could keep going, please, to slide 40. And Bonnie, do you want to go over the resources, or Heather?
Sure. We have a website, which I am totally proud of. It's the tribaltrafficking.org website. It's down below on your screen. If you go to this website, it will, you'll see all the bars that the drop downs. This page that you're looking at is the home page. We had a really cool artist that created this image for this project. And the first one is the homepage of the trafficking website. And there's a quick escape little toolbar thingy up on top. So if a victim is looking at this, they need to quickly escape. There's that's available. The next one is about our organization, TLPI, and all the information that's on our websites. The next one is about all the tribal coalitions across the country. I think there's like 19, I want to say, and they're all doing really excellent work. And we've partnered with the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition to be able to host these webinars every other Wednesday through the end of the year, pretty much. And they're also doing some amazing work around sex trafficking. But there's all the other coalitions that are listed there, and the links to their websites and the work that they're doing in their regions and their communities. The next link is the next bar is the Victim Services Directory. We wanted to be able to pull resources together for victims of sex trafficking in tribal communities, because we know that it's difficult to often access resources quickly that advocates need to be able to have available to them. So we created this directory, and if it's printed, it's about 6-7 inches thick. So what we decided to do was only list resources where there are tribal coalitions in the states where there are coalitions. So there's only like, I don't know if there's all 19, but all the coalitions at the time when we developed this curriculum and the website, those state resources are listed there. So if you click on one state, then all the resources in that state in that area are listed. And they're also listed by region. So like if you go to Arizona, for example, where there's a coalition, you'll pull up resources. You can click on northern Arizona and also like southern Arizona. So we tried to organize it in a way that was really user-friendly. The next one is trafficking resources. These are, you can see federal laws. There's a link there for the federal laws on sex trafficking, state laws, and also some tribal laws that exist at that time that existed. We try to keep this up to date as much as possible, but it's difficult because, you know, information changes so quickly. So, and then there is a more button, just more resources, more materials that have been developed around sex trafficking. We also have our tribal resource tool up to the left here. And if you click on that, there's also trafficking resources there that you can access. This tribal resource tool is filled with victim service resources for those working in tribal communities that need to have access to resources on all sorts of crimes that are happening in to be able to help victims in tribal communities to address those crime areas.
Thanks, Bonnie.
Okay,
Excellent. Yep.
Abby?
Great, thank you, Bonnie. And thank you everyone again for joining us. We hope that you're able to join us for all the remaining sessions of the Webinar Wednesday series listed up on the screen. Heather just dropped a link in the chat box to register for any of the upcoming webinars if you haven't done so already. And just as a reminder, due to the virtual forum, we unfortunately are not able to always get through all of the exercises, but we do recommend running through all the exercises with your teams, communities, and families post-webinar. And another quick reminder on the certificates of attendance, at the end of the full webinar series, we will be sending them out. And you must attend all of the webinars for the full length of the webinar to receive the certificate of attendance.
All right. Thank you all for your participation today. Ahehe kunda. We'll see you in a couple weeks now before the Thanksgiving holiday or the so-called Thanksgiving holiday for another webinar on Unit 3, and we look forward to seeing you. Take care.
Thank you.